In the frozen wastes of medieval Eastern Europe, where winter transforms the landscape into a white hell and the wind howls like the voices of the damned, one of history's most extraordinary military encounters allegedly took place. The story tells of 500 Teutonic Knights, warriors clad in white mantles bearing black crosses, who faced down a Mongol horde 10,000 strong and emerged victorious. It is a tale that has captured imaginations for centuries, a narrative of faith, steel, and the brutal efficiency of medieval warfare conducted in conditions that would kill most men before battle even began. But how much of this story is historical fact? And how much is legend? The truth, as is often the case with medieval accounts, lies somewhere in the gray area between documented history and the embellishments of chronicle writers who sought to glorify their patrons and their faith. Nevertheless, the encounter, or encounters, between Teutonic Knights and Mongol forces in the 13th century represents a fascinating collision of two of the most formidable military systems the medieval world had ever seen. To understand how such an improbable victory could occur, we must first understand the combatants themselves, the strategic situation that brought them into conflict, the terrain and weather conditions that would prove decisive, and the tactical doctrines that each side brought to the battlefield. Only then can we piece together how a vastly outnumbered force of heavy cavalry could achieve such a devastating victory against warriors who had conquered half the known world. The Teutonic Knights, warriors of the cross. The Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, more commonly known as the Teutonic Order or Teutonic Knights, was founded in Acre during the siege of that city in 1190. Initially established as a hospital order to care for German pilgrims and crusaders, it was quickly transformed into a military order, following the model of the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller. By the early 13th century, the Teutonic Knights had evolved into one of the most formidable military organizations in Christendom. What set the Teutonic Knights apart was their unique combination of monastic discipline and martial prowess. Unlike secular knights who fought for glory, land, or plunder, the Teutonic Knights were warrior monks bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They lived in communal houses, attended regular religious services, and subjected themselves to a strict rule that governed every aspect of their daily lives. This monastic structure created a level of unit cohesion and discipline that was virtually unmatched in medieval warfare, where armies were typically collections of individual warriors bound by personal loyalties rather than institutional organization. In 1226, the Teutonic Order accepted an invitation from Conrad IV, Duke of Masovia, to help subdue the pagan Prussian tribes that had been raiding Polish territories. This marked the beginning of the Prussian Crusade, a decades-long campaign of conquest and conversion that would transform the Teutonic Order from a relatively minor crusading organization into a powerful territorial state. By the mid-13th century, the Teutonic Knights controlled vast territories along the Baltic coast, administering them with a combination of military force and efficient bureaucracy that would later influence the development of the Prussian state. The military effectiveness of the Teutonic Knights rested on several key factors. First was their equipment. Each knight was a heavily armored cavalryman, wearing a full suit of mail armor reinforced with plates at critical points. By the mid-13th century, some knights had access to early forms of plate armor, particularly for the limbs and chest. Their helmets were great helms, cylindrical or conical constructions of steel that completely enclosed the head, offering superior protection at the cost of limited visibility and ventilation. Their primary weapon was the lance, a heavy wooden shaft tipped with a sharp steel point designed for the devastating shock of a cavalry charge. Secondary weapons included swords, typically long, double-edged blades designed for cutting and thrusting, as well as maces, axes, and war hammers for close combat. The Teutonic Knights' horses were also partially armored, with mail or quilted barding protecting the chest and flanks of these expensive and carefully bred war horses. Second was their tactical doctrine. Teutonic Knights were masters of the heavy cavalry charge, a tactic that had dominated Western European warfare for centuries. The charge was not simply a matter of riding at the enemy as fast as possible. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver that required precise timing, formation discipline, and the ability to maintain cohesion even at high speed. When executed properly, a charge by heavy cavalry could shatter shield walls, break infantry formations, and send even veteran troops fleeing in panic. Third was their combined arms approach. While the knights themselves were the elite core of Teutonic armies, they never fought alone. They were supported by sergeants, professional soldiers who served as light cavalry or infantry, and by large numbers of militia and auxiliary troops recruited from the territories under Teutonic control. In the Baltic campaigns, these auxiliaries included Germanized Prussians, Poles, Lithuanians, and other Baltic peoples who had converted to Christianity or allied with the order. The Mongol Empire. The storm from the east. If the Teutonic Knights represented the pinnacle of Western military tradition, the Mongols embodied an entirely different approach to warfare, one that had proven devastatingly effective across the vast expanses of Asia and Eastern Europe. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol armies had conquered an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the borders of Egypt. No military force in the 13th century could match their combination of mobility, discipline, and tactical sophistication. The Mongol military system was built around the horse archer, a warrior type that had dominated the steppes for millennia but had been perfected by Genghis Khan's reforms. Every Mongol warrior was trained from childhood to ride and shoot, learning to loose arrows accurately even at full gallop. Their composite bows, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, were among the most powerful weapons of the age, capable of penetrating mail armor at close range and raining death on enemies from distances at which they could not effectively respond. But the Mongols were far more than simply horse archers. They had absorbed military techniques from every people they conquered, creating a sophisticated combined arms force that included heavy cavalry, siege engineers, and specialized units for specific tactical roles. Mongol heavy cavalry, equipped with lances, sabers, and armor, could engage in close combat when necessary, while their engineers, many of them Chinese or Persian specialists, gave them siege capabilities that allowed them to reduce fortifications that would have stopped other nomadic armies. What truly set the Mongols apart, however, was their strategic and tactical doctrine. Mongol armies were organized on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, that allowed for clear command structures and flexible response to changing battlefield conditions. They practiced an elaborate system of signals using flags, drums, and other instruments that allowed commanders to coordinate the movements of forces spread across vast distances. Mongol tactics emphasized deception, mobility, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses. They would feign retreats to draw enemies into ambushes, use their superior mobility to outflank and encircle opponents, and employ psychological warfare to terrify enemies before battle was even joined. They were masters of the nomadic tradition of horse archery, riding in circles around enemy formations while raining arrows upon them, withdrawing before the enemy could close, and repeating the process until their opponents were exhausted, demoralized, and vulnerable to the final assault. The Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe in 1241 or 1242 had demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of these tactics. At the Battle of Liegnitz in 1241, a Mongol force decisively defeated a combined Polish-German army that included both Teutonic Knights and Knights Templar. At Mohi, they annihilated the Hungarian army. These victories seemed to herald the imminent fall of Western Europe to the Mongol juggernaut. Yet the Mongols had weaknesses, particularly when operating in environments very different from the open steppes that were their natural domain. The dense forests of Eastern Europe restricted their mobility and limited the effectiveness of their encirclement tactics. The harsh Baltic winters, while not unfamiliar to warriors who had campaigned in Siberia, nevertheless imposed severe logistical challenges on armies dependent on grazing for their horses. And fortifications, the stone castles and wooden strongholds that dotted the Baltic landscape, could not be bypassed as easily as on the open steppes, forcing the Mongols to commit to sieges that negated many of their advantages. The strategic situation. Collision course. The specific encounter between Teutonic Knights and Mongol forces that forms the core of our story must be understood in the context of the broader strategic situation in Eastern Europe during the mid-13th century. Following the death of Ögedei Khan in 1241, the Mongol armies withdrew from Central Europe, but they maintained control over the Russian principalities and continued to conduct raids and punitive expeditions into Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic region. The Teutonic Order, meanwhile, was engaged in its long campaign to conquer and Christianize Prussia. This brought them into contact with various pagan Lithuanian and Baltic tribes, some of whom sought Mongol protection or alliance against the expanding Teutonic state. The resulting political situation was complex, with shifting alliances, betrayals, and opportunistic raids characterizing the region's politics. Several factors made conflict between Teutonic and Mongol forces likely. First, the territories they sought to control overlapped. The Teutonic Order wanted to expand its control over the Baltic region, while the Mongols sought to extend their hegemony over all the lands bordering their Russian vassals. Second, ideological factors played a role. The Teutonic Knights saw themselves as warriors of Christ fighting against pagans and infidels. The Mongols, while relatively tolerant of different religions within their empire, demanded absolute submission to Mongol authority. Third, both sides had military cultures that emphasized aggression and the prestige to be gained from victory in battle. The specific engagement that would see 500 knights face 10,000 Mongols likely occurred during one of the Mongol raids into the Baltic region, probably in the winter of 1241–1242, or during the later conflicts of the 1250s–1260s, when Mongol forces conducted punitive expeditions against Lithuania and Poland. The exact date and location remain subjects of historical debate, with some scholars questioning whether the encounter occurred as described or whether it represents an amalgamation of several engagements that have been compressed into a single legendary battle. The weather factor. Winter as a weapon. To understand how 500 knights could defeat 10,000 Mongols, we must first appreciate the role that weather conditions played in medieval warfare, particularly in the extreme climate of Eastern Europe. Winter in the Baltic region is not merely cold. It is a brutal test of human endurance that can kill the unprepared in hours. Temperatures regularly plunge below -20 degrees Celsius, winds scream across the flat landscapes at speeds that make travel nearly impossible, and snowstorms can reduce visibility to a few meters while dumping several feet of snow in a matter of hours. For the Mongols, winter presented both opportunities and challenges. Their experience with the harsh Siberian winters meant they were not unfamiliar with cold weather operations. Indeed, they often preferred to campaign in winter when frozen rivers became highways for their cavalry, and when their armies could live off stored supplies rather than depending on pasture for their horses. However, the forests and marshlands of the Baltic were very different terrain from the steppes, and the logistical challenges of maintaining large cavalry forces in winter in this region were immense. For the Teutonic Knights, Winter was both enemy and potential ally. On one hand, the cold made campaigning miserable and dangerous. Armor that provided life-saving protection in battle became a conductor of deadly cold in winter conditions. Horses required enormous amounts of fodder that had to be stockpiled in advance. Supply lines could be cut by snowstorms that made roads impassable. On the other hand, the Teutonic Order had decades of experience conducting winter operations in the Baltic. They had developed logistics systems for winter campaigning. Their castles and strongholds were designed to provide shelter during the worst weather, and their local knowledge gave them significant advantages over invading forces. The specific snowstorm mentioned in accounts of the battle was likely a bora, a type of severe winter storm common in Eastern Europe that combines heavy snowfall with high winds and plunging temperatures. Such storms can arise suddenly, transforming conditions from merely cold to life-threatening in minutes. Visibility drops to near zero as wind-driven snow creates whiteout conditions. The wind chill can push effective temperatures to -40 degrees Celsius or colder. Frostbite can afflict exposed skin in minutes, and the combination of cold and wind can cause hypothermia even in individuals wearing heavy clothing. In the context of military operations, such conditions are catastrophic for armies that are not prepared for them. Horses become unmanageable or freeze to death. Soldiers lose their way, with entire units simply disappearing into the white void. Weapons become unusable as metal freezes and bowstrings snap from the cold. Communication becomes impossible, and command and control break down completely. The battle. Reconstructing the engagement. Based on the fragmentary historical evidence and our understanding of medieval warfare, we can attempt to reconstruct how the encounter between the Teutonic Knights and Mongol forces might have unfolded. The Mongol force, numbering perhaps 10,000 warriors, though medieval numbers are notoriously unreliable and often inflated, was likely a raiding party that had penetrated deep into Teutonic-controlled territory. Their objective would have been to plunder, gather intelligence, punish rebellious vassals, or demonstrate Mongol power to intimidate potential enemies. The force would have consisted primarily of light cavalry horse archers, supported by contingents of heavy cavalry and possibly some allied or subject troops. The Teutonic force, numbering around 500 knights plus an unknown number of supporting troops, was likely assembled rapidly in response to reports of the Mongol incursion. The Knight brothers would have been supported by sergeants, squires, and auxiliary forces, though the exact composition of the Teutonic force remains unknown. What is clear is that the Teutonic commander made the decision to intercept the Mongols despite being vastly outnumbered, a decision that suggests either supreme confidence, religious fervor, or detailed intelligence about conditions that might negate the Mongol numerical advantage. The two forces likely made contact as the snowstorm was developing or had just begun. The Teutonic Knights, with their superior local knowledge, may have deliberately chosen to engage at this time, recognizing that the weather would neutralize many Mongol advantages. Alternatively, both forces may have been caught by the storm unexpectedly and stumbled into each other in the limited visibility. As the storm intensified, the Mongol force would have faced immediate and catastrophic problems. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, becomes significantly less effective in extreme cold and wet conditions. The animal glues that held the bow's layers together could freeze and crack, while moisture could cause the bow to lose its tension. Even if the bows remained functional, drawing and loosing arrows while wearing heavy gloves or mittens in high winds and near-zero visibility would have been nearly impossible. The Mongol horses, bred for endurance on the steppes, would have struggled in the deep snow and brutal cold. Smaller than the heavy war horses of Western knights, they would have had more difficulty breaking through snowdrifts and maintaining their footing. The Mongol tactical system, which relied on mobility and the ability to maneuver in formation, would have broken down as units lost contact with each other in the whiteout conditions. For the Teutonic Knights, while conditions were still extremely harsh, several factors worked in their favor. Their heavy war horses, larger and more powerful than Mongol ponies, could better break through deep snow. Their full armor, while conducting cold to the body, at least provided protection from the cutting wind and blowing snow. Most importantly, their tactical doctrine did not depend on mobility and maneuver, but on the devastating impact of a single coordinated charge. The Teutonic commander would have recognized that his only chance of victory lay in locating the Mongol force and launching an immediate charge before his own troops succumbed to the conditions. Using drums, horns, and shouted commands, the only forms of communication possible in the storm, the Teutonic Knights formed into their charge formation. The charge itself would have been a terrifying sight, even in limited visibility. 500 armored warriors on massive war horses, moving together in a wedge formation designed to penetrate enemy lines, building speed despite the snow and wind, lances leveled, would have constituted an irresistible force. The sound alone, the thunder of 2,000 hooves, the creaking of leather and armor, the shouted prayers and battle cries, would have been audible even over the howling wind. When the Teutonic charge struck the Mongol formation, the impact would have been devastating. Mongol warriors, already struggling with their horses in the difficult conditions, unable to use their primary weapons effectively, separated from their units, and unable to execute coordinated maneuvers, would have been scattered like leaves before the storm. Lance points punched through armor and flesh, warhorses trampled men and ponies alike, and the sheer momentum of the charge carried the Teutonic wedge deep into the Mongol formation. But the battle did not end with the initial charge. Medieval battles were not single decisive moments, but rather a series of engagements that could last for hours. After the initial impact, the fighting would have devolved into a brutal melee conducted in nightmarish conditions. Knights wielded swords, axes, and war hammers against Mongol warriors fighting with sabers, spears, and whatever weapons they could bring to bear. The snow would have been churned into a bloody slush, and visibility would have been so limited that soldiers could barely distinguish friend from foe. The Mongols, despite their disadvantages, would not have collapsed immediately. These were veteran warriors who had conquered kingdoms and slaughtered armies across 2 continents. They would have fought with desperate courage, attempting to rally and employ their superior numbers to surround and overwhelm the knights. Mongol heavy cavalry, less affected by the weather than the horse archers, would have countercharged, and savage close-quarters fighting would have ensued. Yet the factors that had favored the Teutonic Knights in the initial engagement continued to tell against the Mongols. Separated from their units, unable to coordinate their actions, fighting in conditions that negated their training and tactics, and facing an enemy specifically designed for close-quarters combat, the Mongol warriors found themselves at a crippling disadvantage. The superior armor of the Teutonic Knights meant that Mongol weapons often failed to inflict serious wounds, while every strike from the knights' heavier weapons could kill or maim. As the battle continued, hypothermia and exhaustion began to claim victims on both sides. Men froze to death where they stood, horses collapsed from the cold, and the storm showed no signs of abating. But the Teutonic Knights, fighting close together and maintaining unit cohesion, were better positioned to survive than the scattered Mongol forces. The turning point likely came when the Mongol command structure broke down completely. Cut off from their commanders, unable to receive or transmit orders, facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once in the blinding snow, Mongol units began to break and flee. Once the retreat began, it quickly became a rout. Fleeing soldiers scattered in all directions, many simply vanishing into the storm, never to be seen again. The Teutonic Knights pursued as far as their horses could carry them, cutting down fleeing enemies and ensuring that the Mongol force was completely destroyed. The aftermath. Analyzing the victory. When the storm finally passed and the full extent of the carnage became clear, the battlefield would have presented a horrific sight. Thousands of frozen corpses, both human and equine, would have littered the snow-covered ground. The Teutonic Knights, while victorious, would have suffered significant casualties of their own. Perhaps 150 dead from combat and cold, along with many more wounded or suffering from frostbite and exposure. The Mongol force had been effectively annihilated. Of the original 10,000 warriors, perhaps only a few hundred survived to bring word of the disaster back to their commanders. The psychological impact of the defeat was enormous. The Mongols, who had seemed invincible, had been crushed by a force a fraction of their size. The aura of Mongol invincibility was broken, at least in the Baltic region. Several factors explain this improbable Teutonic victory. Environmental conditions. The snowstorm was the decisive factor. It neutralized the Mongol advantages in mobility, archery, and numerical superiority, while playing to the Teutonic strengths in armor, close combat capability, and heavy cavalry shock action. The Mongols had conquered in every climate and terrain, from tropical jungles to Arctic tundra. But even they could not overcome the combination of a prepared enemy and the worst weather conditions possible for their tactical system. Tactical doctrine. The Teutonic charge was perfectly suited to the conditions. It did not require visibility, complex maneuvers, or extended communication. It was a simple, brutal tactic that depended on shock and momentum, factors that remained effective even in a blizzard. Equipment. The full armor of the Teutonic Knights, while making them slower and less maneuverable than the Mongols, provided crucial protection in close combat. The Mongol reliance on composite bows, normally a significant advantage, became a liability when those bows became unusable in the extreme cold and moisture. Unit cohesion. The monastic discipline of the Teutonic Knights allowed them to maintain formation and coordination, even in conditions where most armies would have simply disintegrated. The Mongol forces, despite their own excellent discipline, could not maintain unit cohesion when visibility dropped to near zero and communication became impossible. Local knowledge. The Teutonic Knights' familiarity with the Baltic winter and the local terrain gave them a subtle but important advantage in navigating and surviving the conditions. Momentum and morale. Once the Teutonic charge broke the Mongol formation, the psychological shock combined with the physical impact to create a cascading collapse. The Mongols, unable to employ their usual tactical solutions and fighting in nightmarish conditions, lost the initiative and never recovered it. Historical context and legacy. The encounter between Teutonic Knights and Mongol forces, whether it occurred exactly as described or represents a conflation of several battles, had significant strategic and psychological impacts on the medieval world. For the Teutonic Order, the victory, assuming it occurred as dramatically as reported, provided powerful propaganda for their crusading mission. It demonstrated divine favor and the righteousness of their cause, helping to attract recruits and donations from across Catholic Europe. It also provided a tactical template for fighting against highly mobile cavalry forces, lessons that would prove valuable in the Order's ongoing wars against Lithuanian and other Baltic peoples. For the Mongol Empire, the defeat, if it occurred, may have contributed to the decision not to resume large-scale operations in the Baltic region. While the Mongols continued to conduct raids and maintain hegemony over Russian principalities, they never again attempted to conquer the territories controlled by the Teutonic Order. Whether this was due to military setbacks, logistical challenges, or strategic priorities elsewhere in their vast empire remains debated by historians. The battle also represents an important case study in how environmental factors can override numerical and even qualitative military advantages. Throughout military history, weather has often played a decisive role. From the storms that destroyed the Mongol invasion fleets sent against Japan to the Russian winter that defeated Napoleon and contributed to German failures in World War II. The encounter between Teutonic Knights and Mongols in the Snowstorm stands as perhaps the most dramatic example from the medieval period. Conclusion: fact, legend, and historical truth. How much of this story is historical fact? The honest answer is that we cannot be entirely certain. Medieval chronicles are notoriously unreliable, often inflating numbers, embellishing events, and attributing causation to divine intervention rather than mundane factors. The sources for Mongol-Teutonic encounters are fragmentary, often written decades after the events by authors with clear biases in favor of the Christian knights. What we can say with confidence is that Teutonic Knights and Mongol forces did encounter each other in Eastern Europe during the 13th century. We know that engagements occurred, and that the Teutonic Order successfully defended its territories against Mongol incursions. We know that winter conditions in the Baltic were severe enough to dramatically affect military operations. And we know that the Mongol tactical system, while devastatingly effective in most environments, had specific vulnerabilities that a prepared and disciplined enemy could exploit. Whether a single battle occurred in which 500 knights defeated 10,000 Mongols in a snowstorm, or whether this story represents a legendary compression of multiple encounters and campaigns, is ultimately less important than what the story reveals about medieval warfare, the collision of different military cultures, and the decisive role that environmental factors could play in determining victory and defeat. The story endures because it captures something essential about the medieval period: the importance of faith and courage, the brutal realities of combat, the decisive role of individual and unit quality over mere numbers, and the reminder that even the most sophisticated military system can be overcome when conditions favor a determined opponent. In the frozen wastes of medieval Eastern Europe, where blizzards could kill as surely as any sword, and where survival itself was an act of will, 500 warriors in white mantles and black crosses allegedly achieved one of the most improbable victories in military history. Whether the details are precisely accurate or have been burnished by centuries of retelling, the story of the Teutonic Knights and the Mongols in the Snowstorm remains a powerful reminder that in war, as in life, nothing is ever truly inevitable, and that courage, preparation, and a little help from the weather can sometimes overcome even the longest odds.